Hello, and welcome to the official podcast of CallUponTheLord.com. My name's Corey Wigington, and this is episode 11. This week we're going to be looking at week 11 of the great story. We're still looking at King David. This is the second week we've looked at David. Last week we looked at David as a shepherd in the service of Paul. And this week we are looking at David as the king. So if you haven't already done so, I encourage you to go out to the Call Upon the Lord website and download this week's study guide that's under the Bible Studies, Corey Wigington, The Great Story section. A lot of other great resources there if you just want to visit the website. And if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to go out to our Facebook page, like us there, follow us on Twitter. We're at facebook.com/calluponthelord and twitter.com/calluponthelord. We also we have a podcast on iTunes, which is just the audio version of this broadcast. And one other thing. Yes, of course, our YouTube page is Call Upon the Lord Video, which, since you're here, I probably don't need to tell you that. So anyway, I encourage you to like us on social media. Let's go ahead and get started for this week. So you remember from last week, we ended with Saul and his sons out in battle, with Saul being killed by the Philistines after retreating from battle. We open up the book of 2 Samuel, and we find David had returned from his battle. He was out fighting the Amalekites, and he returns to his camp. He finds a messenger there, someone waiting on him with news from Saul, someone from Saul's camp. So the messenger comes into David, and reports to him that Saul and Jonathan are both dead. And David asks him, well, how do you know these things? Where did you get your information from? Let's go ahead and look at that here. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 6 through 10. And it says, "And the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called to me. I answered him, Here I am. And he said, Come to me. Who are you? I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish had seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head, and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord." So, here's a guy that, according to his story at least, he was trying to do the noble thing, trying to put Saul out of his misery, for all the good that was. I mean, that wasn't, the most sinless thing to do, if that's a phrase. Still some sin, obviously, in killing somebody, a lot of sin. But he phrased it as a mercy killing, and he had basically saved Paul from being ravaged by the Philistines, and he'd brought the crown and Saul's armlet to David, as a token, really. I mean, really at this point you kind of see this guy trying to win favor with David by doing this. David's response? Well, he ordered the guy killed. He told his servants to come in and say, "You're dead. Because of what you have said, you have forfeited your life. You are dead now." So, why did David want this guy killed? Well, there were multiple reasons why. The first reason, and this may or may not have been clear to David, but we know from 1 Samuel 31, 3 through 6, that this guy was lying. Saul took his own life. He fell on his own sword, and it said Saul, died from that. So first thing is, this guy's lying. He didn't come upon Saul while he was alive. Saul was already dead. But yet this guy admitted basically to killing Saul. Even though he didn't, he still admitted to killing Saul. Likely what happened is he wandered up on Saul prior to the Philistines getting there, and took the crown, took the armlet, and fabricated the rest of the story in order to win favor with David. except people didn't understand how David viewed Saul. David viewed Saul as the anointed of God, as someone that God had put into that place, and it had kept there for a reason. David did not want to take it upon himself to do anything against Saul. Kind of, it's reminiscent of Moses, really, when Aaron and his sister Miriam came to him and was basically saying, the Lord speaks to us, the Lord uses us, and the Lord basically told them, it's like, wait a minute, Moses is my anointed one. I speak face to face with Moses. Why would you ever talk bad about him or raise your voice to him? He is my anointed. Why aren't you in fear? It's kind of what we see here with David. He sees Saul as being the anointed of God, and he doesn't actually want to do anything against Saul. It's like, he's the Lord's anointed. If the Lord wants something done with him, the Lord will do it. His blood's not going to be on my hands. And nobody seemed to understand that through the whole thing. Twice in 1 Samuel, we saw where somebody had, David's own men had basically said, look, the Lord's given him into your hands. You can go kill him. And David's like, no. The Lord can deal with him as the Lord's going to deal with him. Either he's going to die an old man or he'll die in battle, but he's not going to die by my hand. Well, again, we see this guy here trying to win favor by killing Saul, something that David had refused to do. It's not going to win any points with David. So the second reason why he probably killed him was because he had basically admitted to killing Saul. If David wasn't aware that Saul had basically killed himself, this guy admitted to killing Saul, the Lord's anointed. In David's eyes, he acted against the Lord, and that was punishable by death. So he might have killed him for that reason. And the last reason, of course, is he said he was an Amalekite. And we know from 1 Samuel that the Lord had ordered all Amalekites killed. Men, women, children, their animals, everybody. So by him coming up and saying that he was Amalekite, David just got out of a battle with the Amalekites. Probably enough there for the guy to forfeit his life. So he certainly didn't win any points with David by saying this, and basically forfeited his life by saying that he had killed Saul. So that should have been the end of it. Everyone knew that David had been anointed, that he should have been the next king, except Saul had other sons. So they felt like, because Saul was king, that the kingship should pass to them rather than to David. So there became a war of the houses, if you will. Saul's house versus David's house. So what happened initially after this whole scenario plays out with the Amalekite here, David goes to the Lord, seeks him, and says, Lord, should I go into Judah? Should I visit any of the cities in Judah? And the Lord tells him, yes, you just go into Hebron. So David does. He goes into Hebron, and while he's there, he is anointed king over Judah, the tribe of Judah, which, David was of the tribe of Judah, so that's okay. Problem was, Saul's son, Ishbosheth, didn't want to cede the throne to David. He thought, Saul was my father. I'm one of the only sons of Saul remaining, so I should be the king. So rather than basically kneeling before David and saying, David, you're the anointed of God now, Ishbosheth started a battle here. It says he was 40 years old, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. So basically what happened here, we had the two houses fighting one another. And 2 Samuel 3:1 tells us that as they were fighting, David's forces continually got stronger, while Saul's forces continually got weaker. So Ishbosheth was basically losing the battle here. There was another son of Saul. His name was Abner. And Abner, during this whole time, he was also growing stronger and building his base up. And he got in his mind, basically, that he wanted to be in charge of this, of Saul's remnant. So what he did was, and Didn't turn out very well for him, but what he did was he decided to take his father's concubine as his own. Now, in that culture, that was the equivalent of saying, I am in charge now. I've taken my father's concubine. I am, I am the patriarch now, and I'm in charge of this family. Well, Ishbosheth was the one that was vying to be king. So Abner and Ishbosheth were getting along at this time, and then when Abner took Saul's concubine, now suddenly there's this division. Ishbosheth goes to Abner, and they have a confrontation, and Abner's infuriated with Ishbosheth basically and says, look, I'm just going to throw my support behind David. So Abner runs off, and he goes and tries to meet with David, and he does. He comes to David. They have their meeting, and Abner basically tells him, that he's going to gather all of Israel and crown David the king. So after their meeting, Abner leaves in peace. David has no beef with him. He's basically said that David's going to be king, so Abner leaves. Well, there's a little kink that gets thrown in here, because during all of these battles, the Battle of Gibeon, actually, a scenario kind of played out where the forces of Saul and the forces of David were kind of facing off, and they decided to have 12 of their champions face off against each other. And then, of course, the winner being the victor. I don't know why they did this. This never seemed to work out right for them in the Bible. I mean, when the Philistines tried to do that with Israel and David slew Goliath, Philistines just ran. They didn't abide by their agreements. Kind of the same thing happened here, really. They decided that they were going to have the battle. Their 12 champions face each other. They fought each other. They all ended up dying. And the forces of Saul were retreating. Abner was running away, and a man by the name of Asahel, I apologize if I butchered that, he basically pursued Abner. And Abner turned around and said, stop following me, go into the left or the right, take the plunder off of this guy, just leave me alone. But he wouldn't, is the problem. So Abner ended up killing this man by the name of Asahel. Problem was, he was the brother of Joab, and Joab was the commander of David's army. So after Abner had left after meeting with David, Joab comes home. And Joab, goes in with meeting with David and determines, Abner was just here. What was he doing? So they talk, and Joab tries to convince David, this guy, he's trying to deceive you. He's doing all this, behind your back and doing all this. David doesn't believe him, though. So Joab takes it upon himself to go out and kill Abner. Basically, he sends a messenger, tells Abner to come back, ends up meeting with him, and then meets him at Hebron. And during their discussion, he stabs him in the stomach, and Abner dies. So David's not too happy about this. He was innocent in the whole affair. He didn't know what was going on. Matter of fact, it says that David cursed the house of Joab from that time on, because he basically had did this wrong. So a little bit of problems going on in the ranks, I guess. But we still have this issue of Ishbosheth out there. He still wants to be king. Well, he hears about Abner. Of course, he's grieved about Abner. And he goes into his tent and lies down. Of course, this is a little bit on down in the section a little bit. Story continues on. It says where he goes in his tent and lays down. It says he has 2 captains in his army. Let's go ahead and read this here. Basically, the 2 captains decide that Ishbosheth's time is up. They go into his tent. They end up killing him, cutting his head off, and then bringing it to David. And let's see what David thought of this. This is in 2 Samuel 4, 9 through 12. All right. Look at this here. It says, "But David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, Behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house, on his bed? Shall I not now require his own blood at your hand, and destroy you from the earth?" And David commanded his young men, and they killed them, and cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them beside the pool of Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth, and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. So what happened here? David is a just king. I mean, he was battling against Ishbosheth, but he still saw him as being a righteous man trying to do what he thought was right. I mean, he hadn't done anything wrong to these men. He was lying down in bed, and these guys come in and attacked him. So he references back to where the Amalekite came with news of Saul and said, I killed that guy when he thought he was delivering good news about Saul. What am I going to do with you, who are basically admitting to killing a guy who was innocent? What am I going to do to you? Of course, he does the same thing. He kills them. So, you don't win any points with David by doing something wrong and then trying to frame it of, I was doing this for your own good. No, you either worked against the Lord here, you committed a sin or something, and it requires, just punishment. And that's what David did. So after this event, David is named king of all of Israel, because really there's no one left to oppose him. So David, he was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. It says he reigned for 7 years as king of Judah, and then an additional 33 years as king of all of Israel. During that time, David was very successful in all of his military campaigns. It talks about him almost immediately after being crowned king. He goes into Jerusalem, which is aptly called the city of David, goes into Jerusalem and drives out the Jebusites. Other people before him had attacked Jerusalem, even won, but they've never actually been successful in driving out the people that inhabited the city. Well, he did. He went in, attacked, drove out the Jebusites. He defeated the Philistines on a couple of occasions. It says he also defeated the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Syrians. So basically, every military campaign that he tried, he was successful at. And why? And the question is why? It's because he always sought God first. What do I need to do? What is righteous? What needs to be done? The Lord told him, and he acted. That was kind of the pattern for David here. So David was successful in all that he did. Of course, David was also a pretty good king. I mean, you remember back when we were talking about David and Jonathan last week, about how they were as close as brothers. And Jonathan had actually said that there is a covenant between us, between me and you, and between my seed and your seed, that will never be broken. Well, now that David's king, he's trying to do something, basically do the right thing here. It says in 2 Samuel 9:1, David says, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for the sake of Jonathan?" So he's still remembering Jonathan, remembering his oath to him that he saw that his house would not be cut off, and David would basically be with him, or show kindness to his family long into the future when David was king. And someone comes to David and said, yes, actually, Jonathan, he had a son. His name was Mephibosheth. So, what had happened here was Jonathan's son, he was about 5 years old when Jonathan died, and said his nurse fled with him. It doesn't go in great detail and explain exactly what was wrong with him. It says he was lame of foot, some type of a handicap where he couldn't walk well. This boy was also around 12 years old when Ishbosheth died. So he's basically out there. He's being raised by his nurse. He really doesn't have anything. I mean, his father's dead, but all of the rest of his family's dead. His land now belongs to David. So, he doesn't really have anything here. So David sends for him. And he comes in, sits down, and David says, look, I will show you kindness for Jonathan's sake. You will always eat at my table. I will restore to you all the land that was previously Saul's, which was probably a lot since Saul was king. I mean, he probably had a pretty good homestead. He said, I'll restore to you all the land that was Saul's, and you will eat at my table continually. He was very, very nice to this guy. Of course, later on we see where there was another person that tried to talk badly about Mephibosheth, basically saying that he was trying to set himself up as king, and when David was gone, that he would be the ruler of all of Israel. And David ends up confronting Mephibosheth later and saying, was this true? And he basically meets him, and the guy he's in mourning basically for David. And he said, was it true that you were setting yourself up as king? And no, it wasn't true. That he was, he's completely behind David and completely supported him, basically restored the faith that David had in him. And David ended up giving him more stuff than what he previously had there. So David, he was a good king, good administrator, but he wasn't without problems. Actually, we'll get to that in a minute. Talking about the ark next. So David was successful, of course, in retaking Jerusalem. He's successful in his military campaigns. He was a good king. The next thing that he thought to do was, let's bring the ark of God back into Israel. So, or back into Jerusalem. So he sends out a party and decides to go get the ark. Now let's look at that. It's in 2 Samuel 6:3 in particular is what I want to look at. So David has sent for the ark. Let's see how they did that. It says, and they carried the ark of the new covenant on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahiah, the sons of Abinab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahiah went before the ark. I apologize for those names. I'm going to have to practice those before I keep doing this. Some of that Hebrew's a little bit hard to pronounce. Anyway, well, what did we see there? They put the ark of God onto a new cart. Now the Philistines did the same thing, remember, and that didn't work out too well for them. Well, what happened here? They put the ark of God on a cart. According to Old Testament law, the ark of God was supposed to be carried on poles. So they put this on a new cart, and it talks about how they were riding along, and they came upon some rough ground, and one of the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah puts his hand up to try to steady the ark, and as soon as he touches it, it says the anger of the Lord burned against him, and he died. The Lord struck him dead for touching the ark, because the ark was holy and you weren't supposed to touch the ark. Matter of fact, it was only the Levites really that were supposed to transport this. So, and then they weren't allowed to touch it either. Only couple people were actually allowed to do that, and only after a time of purity and cleansing, and it was a big deal. So Uzzah reaches out his hand, touches the ark, and it kills him. And it says David was both angered and afraid of the Lord at that time. Now, I definitely see being afraid of the Lord during that time. I mean, when he makes somebody a little greasy spot, you kind of have to think twice about what you're doing and what you did to upset the Lord. So I said, rather than bringing the ark all the way to Jerusalem, it says he left the ark at the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, and left it there for about 3 months. And then he started hearing word from the people that basically the whole house of Obed-Edom had been blessed because they were keeping the ark there. And David decided, okay, now it is time to bring the ark back. And how did they transport it this time? Well, let's look down at 2 Samuel 6:13. And it says, and when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. That's a little different than putting it on a cart. It said those who bore the ark, they took 6 steps. Now they're transporting it the right way. They got the poles out there. The guys are actually bearing the ark on their shoulders. Now they're doing it the right way. So, they bring the ark. They take it to Jerusalem. And it says, the whole time, David had music playing. He was out in front of the ark, and he was dancing in his linen ephod. Now, I had always heard, really, and growing up, I'd always thought that meant his underwear, and I guess in some places that does mean undergarments. But according to the Erdman's Bible Dictionary, that could also mean a type of a priestly robe, a sleeveless priestly robe, a robe worn by the high priest. It doesn't really matter what he was wearing. I guess not in this context. The point is that he's out there, he's giving thanks to the Lord, he's praising the Lord, he's giving his worship and showing that he is humbled before God. Now, you got to think, David's pretty excited about this. I mean, he's dancing there in front of the ark, and he's showing all of Israel, that God is God and he is the servant of God. Then you have his wife, Michal, looking down from her window, looking down, seeing David dance before the street, and she's not happy about this. She thinks he's being a clown, just down there behaving the way he was. Let's look at that in 2 Samuel 6:20 through 23. Just read that real quick. So David finishes the ceremony, and now he's coming home to bless his house. And it says, and David returned to bless his house, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. And David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as prince over Israel and the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abashed in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. See, this drove quite a wedge between Michal and David. You remember, Michal was the daughter that he had won from Saul, basically for he killed Goliath. Saul offered him, the daughter, and David ended up going out and getting 100 foreskins of the Philistines to basically pay for her. This was the wife of his youth, and she comes out and basically says, why are you acting like such a fool? Because she didn't understand where David was coming from. He was giving glory to God, and it wasn't her place to question the worship that he was giving. She was more worried about how people perceived him rather than giving worship to God, and that offended David. So they had a little bit of a falling out there. A little bit later, of course, after this, David has the ark in Israel, or in Jerusalem now, and he gets thinking, I live in this nice cedar house. I need to build a house for the Lord. And he goes and talks to the prophet Nathan. Nathan says, do as your heart desires. And of course, Nathan tells him, go ahead and do that. But Nathan goes home, and the Lord comes to him and says, look, I've never lived in a house. I've never asked you to build me anything. I've been fine living out in the tents among the people. So I really don't want you to build me a house. But he goes on to tell David a couple other things. I mean, David was a warrior king. He had a lot of blood on his hands. It really wasn't appropriate for him to build the house. But he gives David some prophecy here. Let's look at that. It's in 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16. And it says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will rise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be with him. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, in accordance with all the vision, Nathan spoke this to David. Now we get a couple things out of this here, and it's kind of neat. It kind of had a twofold interpretation. One, for the immediate future, he was speaking of Solomon, that his son, David's son, would build a temple or build a house for God, and that his kingdom would be established through Solomon. This is also a messianic prophecy, talking about how his kingdom will be established forever, and that he will be a father to him, and he will be my son. It also speaks of the Messiah. So kind of a twofold thing there, kind of a neat little thing. We see that again, that Jesus was the descendant of the root of David. So moving on here, now we run into some problems for David. David's been pretty good up to this point. Been a good king, like I said. He's been trying to do the right thing by asking to build a house for God. He's been good, but now he's going to have some problems. So we start off looking in 2 Samuel 11:1. And that says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all of Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Now wait a minute. Joab was the commander of the army. Of course, we know that. Then he was appointed the commander of the army. David was the king, though. David was the one who led the battles. That's why Israel wanted a king in the first place, someone to go out and fight their battles for them. But David didn't go. David stayed in Jerusalem and sent his men out to fight. Well, that was his first mistake. His second mistake was what happened next. It says, he woke in the middle of the night and he walked out on his roof. And he looked over and he saw a beautiful woman bathing in the moonlight. And he inquired after her and found out that her name was Bathsheba, and that she was the wife of Uriah, who was deployed with the army. So David sent his messengers after them, or after her, and brought her back. And it says she had just been cleansed of her impurity. That's what the Bible says about her. Well, what that means is that she was, it talks about menstruation basically. When the woman menstruated, she was unclean, and she had to go through a period of cleansing before she was ceremonially clean again. So it talks about her basically had just finished cleansed from her impurity. What we gather from that is that she wasn't pregnant at that time. And that becomes very important in the text because of the next thing that happens. He sends his men for her in a very romantic gesture, I guess, because that seems right. And then he brings her into the palace and he ends up sleeping with her. So a lot of sins going on here, but it only gets worse. So she contacts David a little bit later and says, by the way, I'm pregnant now. Now David's got even a bigger problem. I mean, he tried to do his sin in the dark, in the quiet, where nobody would know about it. But now there's evidence basically of his adultery. So he sends for Uriah. Uriah comes back, brings a report from the battlefield, and he talks to Uriah. And after he gives his report, he says, "All right, go home, wash your feet, take it easy for a little bit, just relax." What David is hoping is that Uriah will go home and sleep with his wife, since he's been out to war. He'll come home, sleep with his wife, and then everything will be kind of covered up, because by the time Uriah gets back, well, she'll be pregnant and he won't know the time difference, basically. Well, Uriah won't do that. Uriah's a good man. He says, no, all of Israel, they're out at battle. Servants of the king are out to battle, and I can't go home while everybody's deployed. I mean, that wouldn't be right. So he sleeps on the footstep of the king, of the king's house. Doesn't actually go home. What's David going to do? Well, he's going to send some more, is what he's going to do. So he sends a letter with Uriah. This is just horrible. He sends a letter with Uriah back to Joab. So this man is carrying a letter that's basically his own death sentence. And he doesn't read it because he's a good man. He hands it to Joab. Joab looks at it, and it says, put Uriah into the forefront, the pinnacle, the very, the most fierce part of the battle. And then once the battle really heats up, retreat, get away from him. Make sure he dies, basically. And, of course, that's exactly what happened. They go into battle. Uriah gets up in front. They retreat. Uriah's surrounded, and he's killed. David then brings Bathsheba into his household and tries to quiet the whole thing down. He thinks he's got away with it, but he really didn't. And we see that in our next little section here. And this is going to be a little bit longer of a section to read, but I think it's important to read the whole thing. This is Nathan's parable. It's found in 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 15. Let's read that. It says, "And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. He used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come for him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, "You are that man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will rise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel and before the sun." And David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." And Nathan said to David, "The Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die." Then Nathan went to his house. So, quite a little story there. Nathan was basically, he has the nerve, or the will basically, to come before David and call him out on his sin, and he does it in a way that basically gets David to pronounce judgment on himself. Basically says this man needs to die, and that's basically what needed to happen there. But when Nathan said, "You are that man," and this is what the Lord has said, a couple things there that we need to take from that. It says, one, that the sword will never depart from your house because you despise me. It says that he will raise up an adversary from his own house. It talks about his wives going off and being with other men. And the big thing here is it says that the child that was born to because of this, he's going to die. Of course, Nathan David, he repented. Right at the end, he says, "I have sinned against the Lord." And that's right, he had sinned against the Lord. But he repented of it, and Nathan said, "The Lord has forgiven you, but there's still going to be some punishment involved here. You're forgiven, your life won't be required of you, but there's still going to be some punishment involved. Your punishment's going to be the child's going to die." So, after this is when David writes Psalm 51, and I'm actually running out of time here, so I'm not going to read Psalm 51 to you, but I suggest you go and read it, because this is the context that he wrote that. He talks about how he has sinned against the Lord and the Lord alone. And when you read that kind of out of context, like, well, you sinned. Yeah, you sinned against Uriah. You sinned against Bathsheba, the child that died. You were lying to people about it. But he did wrong to those people, but the only person he actually sinned against was God. Because God's the one that has the righteous standard, the moral standard, the one that says, "Here are my commandments," and that you have to follow. David sinned against the Lord alone. So that's why he repented to the Lord. And that's kind of what we read in Psalm 51. You should go take a look at that. Other thing it said, in Psalm 51 was David understood that because he was sinned, that he needed to be restored in the sight of the Lord. It talks about being cleansed with hyssop and made pure and holy again, so he could go minister to the people and lead them out of their sins. He understood that he had to work on himself to become pure and holy and seek God, so through his grace he could minister to the people. That's good advice for anyone who wants to minister or teach or anything. You really need to seek God first, deal with your own sin before you go out and start ministering and teaching. So other thing we see here out of this is God forgave Bathsheba for this. We know that because, well, one, nothing happened to Bathsheba. Two, other of course than her child dying, but two, Solomon was the son of Bathsheba. So obviously something good came from that at least. Now our last little section here is one on treason. So we just read there that adversity would come out of David's own house. Well, now we see that happening from Absalom, who was David's son. And it even says in excuse me, it says in 2 Samuel 14:25, now in all of Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. For the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish on him. Boy, that kind of sounds like Saul, doesn't it? That's why they elected Saul as their king, was that he was more handsome than anyone in the land, that he was taller than anybody else, and that's what they looked for in a king, someone who was physically well off, and that's really what they were attributing being a good king. He has to look good. Well, that's kind of what Absalom used to play off of, and kind of get the people to support him. Of course, we see the first little bit of problem arise with this. There's a little trio story going on between Absalom, Amnon, and Tamar. Amnon basically desired Tamar. Tamar was their sister. I think it was Amnon's half-sister. But he desired her. He wanted to sleep with her. So basically what ended up happening was a scenario came about where Amnon raped Tamar. Absalom found out about it and ended up murdering his brother. Problem was, Amnon deserved to die for his sin, but it wasn't Absalom's place to carry out that sentence. So it really upset David, and David basically wouldn't speak with Absalom for a long time, and basically kept ignoring his request to come in and to see him and kind of work things out. Well, after a little bit of time passed, David ends up forgiving Absalom, and Absalom's like, okay, here's my opportunity. So he goes to Hebron, and the Bible says he sends out his spies and basically gathers support from all of Israel that Absalom, he's going to be our new king, and he declares himself king in Judah. Well, of course, David hears about this, and he sees that all of Israel's behind him, and he ends up fleeing. Well, comes about that there's battles between Absalom's forces and David's forces, and David is adamant every time that they engage, like, deal gently with him for my sake. Don't hurt Absalom. Well, Absalom's army, of course, was eventually defeated. The story goes that a soldier had saw Absalom riding on a mule, and it says his hair had got tangled up in some branches. Earlier on it talks about how thick his hair was, and how he used to cut it every year and weigh it, and it was like 200 shekels. So he had a thick head of hair. Could have been that he got his hair caught up in the branches, or that he got his neck caught in like a fork of a branch or something. But he was basically hanging there and couldn't get free. It says the mule went on out from under him. The soldier told Joab this, and Joab's like, wait, this just happened? So Joab goes out and he ends up killing Absalom, sticks him with a spear and kills him while he's still stuck in the tree. And of course this gravely, immensely grieved David, because he didn't want any harm to come to Absalom. He was his son, and he wanted, he loved his son. He didn't want anything bad to happen to him. But Of course, because of what he did with Bathsheba, you remember that adversity was always going to be in his house, and that someone would have been raised up to attack him, and that was Absalom. So we see prophecy fulfilled here, and David, I think he realized that. So it's not all of David, but I think that's all that we're going to have a chance to cover here. So, of course, David ends up living out the rest of his life, which wasn't too long after this, and he turns over the kingdom to Solomon. And that's who we're going to talk about next week. Week 12 is going to be all about Solomon, about the good, the bad, the rich, and the ungodly. So, what lessons did we learn from this week? First thing we learned is forgiveness is always available for sin, but sometimes there's punishment still required. And we saw that in the case of David. He killed Uriah, trying to hide his sin. Nathan came to him, told him the story, and he says, I have sinned. I've sinned before the Lord. And Nathan tells him, the Lord has forgiven you, but the child's still going to die. The Lord forgave him of his sin, but that didn't mean that there still wasn't consequences. The Lord forgave him, but the child was going to die. That happens sometimes. So there are consequences. Even though we receive forgiveness, sometimes we still have to pay for our sins. And the second thing, of course, we got out of Psalm 51 was a clean, blameless heart before the Lord is necessary before ministering to others. David talked about being cleansed with hyssop before going out and ministering and turning the people from their sins. Well, that's a good thing. I mean, if you are not blameless before others, if others can look at your life and say, boy, he is not living what he's preaching, that doesn't do any good for the message of the gospel. When you're teaching somebody the word, you need to look and, in all appearance, outward and inward, that you are following the word of God to the best of your ability. You may not be perfect. I don't mean that you are perfect, you're doing everything right, but you are living in subjection to God and in humility, that you are, you're humble, that you acknowledge God in all things, and even when you sin, you repent of it. So that's something that we really need to get out of that. You need to get yourself right with God, and then He can use you to help others. Well, that's all that I have for this week. I hope you enjoyed David. I've certainly enjoyed reading about David again. It's been about 6-7 months since I've been in the book of Samuel, so I've really enjoyed that. So I hope you join us back here next time. Like I said, we'll be covering Solomon next time, and one of these days I'm actually going to record 2 of these in a week, maybe catch up a little bit where I'm supposed to be. I think I'm supposed to be recording week 16 this week, but a little bit behind schedule. So hopefully I can kind of catch up a little bit and get out a few more of these. But until then, I hope you join us back here next Thursday. God bless you. Keep reading, keep praying, and we'll see you later.